LinkedIn is one of the best places if you're trying to learn anything. And then, of course, also all the user groups. So HubSpot has great user groups. Marketo user groups are amazing. Any question that you've had about Marketo or HubSpot, someone has asked on some forum in 2015, and they might not have the answer, but at least you know that there is no answer, and now we have to find a workaround.
It's Attribution Nation time, where we look at attribution from multiple angles in a unique mini-series format. You're in the trenches with me for the next 5 episodes, talking to attribution practitioners. Let's go. All right. Well, I am joined in today's episode by Ms. Bailey Bowes, Marketing Operations Manager at Braze. And we'll talk a little bit more about Bailey's kind of background as we get into the topics here. But let's start out with, let's go way back when. Bailey, how did you first get into marketing operations?
Yeah, let's do it. So like everyone else, you kind of just fall into it. But how I fell into it was a little bit more linear than most. So I started my career at a super, super small fintech startup, like 15 people small, which was great coming right out of college because I was learning a lot and doing a little bit of everything. So as their first marketing hire, I was writing emails and designing things and owning HubSpot as our map and our CRM and like just learning a lot and soaking it all up. After about a year and a half there, I was ready to kind of like move on. And when I was looking for new jobs, I really didn't know like where to look. I was kind of like doing so much and I was like, maybe I'll look at like email roles, like, let's see where that goes. And it's interesting. I actually made it to a final round interview at this company for like an email associate role. And it was a group interview. And one of the people I was meeting in the group was their marketing operations manager. And while I was talking to him, I was like in my head, kind of like, I kind of like what he does. Maybe I actually want to do what he's doing. So really after that conversation, I was like, okay, I think that's what it's called. I think it's called marketing operations, which is really what I like to do. And then from there, really just went on LinkedIn and started looking. And then I stumbled upon DailyPay. And was their second marketing operations hire and was there for about 2.5 years, helping build out a lot of marketing ops functions and the marketing ops team.
Okay, nice. So like everybody else that joins a small company, you were wearing a million hats. And one of those hats just happened to be marketing operations. And so you learned a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
So when you were learning, when you're on your own and you're learning marketing operations and you're doing these things and you don't even really know that it's called marketing operations, like what were some of the resources that you were tapping into to grow your skill set?
Yeah, so LinkedIn is one of the best places if you're trying to learn anything. And then, of course, also all the user groups. So HubSpot has great user groups. Marketo user groups are amazing. Any question that you've had about Marketo or HubSpot, someone has asked on some forum in 2015, and they might not have the answer, but at least you know that there is no answer, and now we have to find a workaround. So really just like getting into the weeds, trying to get involved with different communities. The marketingops.com community is a great place.
Love them.
Yeah, they're fantastic to just really like connect with other people, especially since I was at a company with like a pretty small marketing ops scene. I was kind of like desperately trying to force my way into conversations with other MOPS people to kind of relate and just learn.
Okay, cool. Yeah, huge fan of marketingops.com. Shout out to Mike Rizzo and all the work that he and the team over there are doing. So on LinkedIn, you talked about LinkedIn. Like, who are some of your favorite ops people that you follow on LinkedIn and learn from?
Yeah, I mean, Mr. Mike Rizzo, of course, is like an OG. A couple others that come to mind, AJ Navarro, who of course is one of the reasons why I'm here. He's great. Brooke Bartos is also amazing. She was a reference when we were getting Marketo. She's awesome. Sarah McNamara is also great. Yeah, those are some of the people I constantly see in my feed. You're one of them, Drew Smith.
Oh, well, thank you. That was not paid for, by the way. We did not script that. So thank you, Bailey. Appreciate that. I know all those names. Yeah, absolutely. Those are all great people to follow. So let's talk about you went to DailyPay and you were really finally starting to hone in on marketing operations, and you were the second ops hire there. So what was it like going from, a one person band to now actually having, another ops person that you could bounce ideas off of? And how did that kind of help your growth?
Yeah. So I joined DailyPay at a very interesting time. So as a second MOPS hire, and at that time, DailyPay was really in like hyper growth mode. Had just gotten Salesforce, like everything's getting spun up. We were still on HubSpot. So there was a lot of work to be done because there was a lot of, startup decisions that were made in the systems, that now that the company was growing and moving kind of from hyper growth really just into like a larger company, that needed to change, and a lot of foundational things that needed to be set up in the right way. So one of the things that we did was like move from HubSpot to Marketo, which was very scary at first, being like having no experience with Marketo or anything like that. But we were lucky enough to work with an implementation partner, shout out to Shift Paradigm, who kind of like held our hands throughout that entire project and really made sure that we set up our foundational work correctly. And once that project was really wrapped, like our marketing ops foundations were super solid. So having that solid foundation really made like the biggest difference then when we were like starting to expand the marketing ops team, because I had then a very clear role in like Marketo admin, visible admin. And now we need a person to maybe do things on the B2C side, or it just created these like very clear paths for like how we would expand the team.
Okay.
And now I'm at an even larger company with an even larger team, which is incredibly refreshing to just have people that are older and wiser than me. And I could be like, what was Marketo like 10 years ago? Like, tell me your stories. Tell me what I should do. So it's
yeah. Nice. So when you made the change from HubSpot to Marketo, it's a lot of organizations do that because they kind of like outgrow HubSpot in certain areas. What were do you remember what were some of the pain points that you had back then that really kind of made it clear that you needed to make the switch from HubSpot to Marketo?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the biggest pain points, I would say, was the attribution piece. So everyone wanted attribution, and we had like none of the foundational work to be able to provide any attribution. And that was sort of a challenge with HubSpot, because at that time, HubSpot allowed for even less customization than it does now. So like even a couple of years ago, we couldn't even customize like our lead lifecycle stages, which was like the first barrier. And then also having like a smaller team, kind of like just myself, or, maybe working with an agency ad hoc for like email stuff. It also was like really challenging to get campaigns up and running in like a scalable fashion. So we wanted to do things super fast, hyper growth, right? Like hit the ground running. And HubSpot just like really wasn't helping us do that. Like there was just too much happening in the tool. And I think unfortunately, like this happens with a lot of like startups where like at a certain point, like it is almost better to just start with a fresh slate and start with like a better foundation, because you have this tool that like is 5, 6, 7 years old that like was never really set up in the right way. So it can almost be better to just like start fresh and really like build foundationally like what you need.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, when you think about when an organization's a startup, that they don't need a ton of marketing operations, but when you get to hyper growth, like the need for that process and that operational expertise and operational motion is super important. And it's very difficult to just like build on top of that. To your point, you really do kind of need to start from scratch, right?
Yeah. And it always happens overnight that it's all of a sudden like, well, we need marketing ops.
Yeah, exactly. So you make the decision to switch to Marketo primarily because of the reporting and attribution. When you did the implementation of Marketo Measure Visible, what were some of the items that you kind of had to prepare? Like, did you have to do things with like UTMs and campaign types? Like, what was some of the transformation that you had to do to be successful with Marketo Measure Visible?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of both of those things we had to do. So we did a UTM refresh, and we weren't using Salesforce campaigns at the time, but that was something that we were getting set up in Marketo. And I always say like we it was like kind of like the stars aligned, because we had nothing, which was really hard for a long time. But then because we got everything set up at once, then we had like everything. So we had no Salesforce campaigns, nothing happening there. We did a UTM structure refresh. Once we got Marketo up and running, which was happening in parallel with Visible, we started having Salesforce campaigns, all of our statuses super clean, right? Because we never had those campaigns. So it's all just fresh data flowing into the system. And then from there, it was really just writing those rules into Visible, which again allowed us to have I think some of the cleanest data that Visible may have ever seen, because it was all just brand new. And then, that was really from from the systems perspective, making sure the UTMs and the campaigns and all of that's working. And then all the data was being collected, which was great. And then I'd say the second portion of that was then really just educating people on the data and now being okay, now we have all of this data. Where do we start? How do we use it? How do we understand it? How do we make it helpful?
Okay. So now when you had identified that you had these reporting challenges in HubSpot and you needed to get on Marketo and Marketo Measure, what were some of the questions that people were asking related to attribution that you couldn't do that made it very clear, hey, we need something else?
Oh, yeah. What's driving MQLs? I don't know. We have no idea. How are our paid ads doing? Is our budget too high? Is our budget too low? Can you tell me where should we go to this event again next year? Did we have good ROI? I don't know. I couldn't tell you. A lot of questions I got that I just had no answers to and no way to really even piecemeal it together. We certainly tried. But once we had Visible, it seemed like the door really just opened up for us for all of these questions.
Okay. Yeah. Particularly at the time, if you weren't using Salesforce campaigns, there's no way to do any kind of attribution outside of maybe lead sourcing, if you're tracking lead sourcing. But even then, you would have had to expand on the out-of-the-box methodology that HubSpot had, because at the time they were primarily only doing online sources. So yeah, that would have been very difficult back then. Yeah. So when you got on Marketo Measure, obviously you're now able to answer those questions, right? What was the before and after? So before, you're getting all these questions, can't answer them. After, you're getting some of the same questions, now you can start to answer them, and there's even more questions getting added on. So what was the before and after for you?
Yeah, so the after was great. After about a year or so, at the year and a half at Daily Pay, I was went to our demand gen team and our events team, and I was guys, I have good news. I have it all now. So the after was really a lot of dashboard building and then education on those dashboards. So I did a lot, and really on Visible as a whole, because I said, I think that it can be really daunting when you go from, okay, we have no data, to, okay, we have so much data, we don't even know what to do with it. So what I tried to focus on was really make sure everyone was comfortable with how that data was coming into the system, how to look at that data, how to use that data in their own roles. So for our demand gen team, it looked like creating a dashboard in Salesforce that showed all of our paid media sources, source to MQLs, if those MQLs are converting to opportunities, things like that. Another iteration for events was a similar dashboard, but just trying to show how events maybe touched all of our closed won opportunities in the past year or this quarter and things like that.
So you went from having a whole lot of unanswered questions and doing a whole lot of I don't know and we can't get that, to suddenly you are the ruler of all data in Daily Pay, and you now have way more data than you can even use at this point. And that happened over the course of 3-4 months of doing the Marketo Measure implementation?
Yeah, pretty much within 3 months. We got Marketo Measure Visible up it started collecting data in, let's say, October. And by February, we were all doing weekly dashboard reviews, things like that. And I also can't take all the credit, because we did have an amazing data team who then, of course, took that data from Salesforce, extracted it into Tableau, and created even, more beautiful dashboards to help stitch more data together. But yeah.
So let's talk about those reports. Perfect segue into my next question. So you now have all this data and you're creating reports. So how did you go about collecting requirements for reports and making sure that we're answering the right questions. And how did you kind of go through that process? Because you also have like a maturity process where you're learning this as you go as well, because you just started using Measure. So like, how did that journey happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think, and something I kind of had to like wean myself off of was getting too deep into the data too fast. So we had like all of this data and you kind of are like hungry for it. You're like, oh, this is so cool. And you want to get like very like nitty gritty with it. Like, this is the exact ad that caused this person to MQL. But in reality, that almost is like a little bit too much. Like, you kind of got to walk before you run. So really, like how we started a lot of those conversations with like, whether it's like the demand gen team or the events team, was I would kind of ask them like, what's like your hypothesis? Like, what do you think we should see? And then I'll see what the data says. And we can kind of like start from there. Like you're saying, like maybe they'll come to me and say Q3 should have been like amazing for events. We had a lot of MQLs. We should have closed a lot of deals from those events. Great. That's a great hypothesis. Let me go back and start putting some reports together. I'll put them on a dashboard for you and you can see like if that hypothesis stands. And if it does or doesn't, then we can kind of like dive deeper from there. But I think really just starting with like top level, like, is really important. Even if it's just like, are things going good or bad? Are MQLs good or bad? Do we have high invalid rates? Like things like that, like really just like from the top.
Okay, I love that. So you kind of had to like, let me just kind of like recap a little bit. What I think I heard is, so you had to like almost slow yourselves down because you suddenly had this just mountain of data that everybody wanted to just dive right into it like it's a big pile of leaves. But you really kind of had to take a hold on. We got to make sense of this first before we can just jump right in. And then when you did start jumping in, you approached it from a let's build a hypothesis and then use the data to test the hypothesis kind of standpoint. I love that. That's awesome. I think that the starting with a hypothesis and testing the hypothesis is a really interesting way to approach reporting and data. Because I think a lot of people just start building reports without really having a very specific reason for why we're building the report. So starting with that hypothesis really directs how you build the report.
Yeah, it really does. And I think something I've kind of run into with that is I think sometimes people are hesitant to have a hypothesis, but I'm always like, tell me what you think we should see, because then at least we have a starting point. Because like you said, like if it's like, oh, let's just see how events are going, like we could get so wrapped up with like all these like data points, but having that hypothesis really helps you like kind of zone out and at least know where to start.
Well, yeah, it also helps you focus because, you mentioned it yourself is like people always want to just ask the question like, well, how are events going? What does going mean? Like, I can't answer that question without understanding what going means. Going could mean 25 different things, or it could mean one thing. So if you start from a hypothesis, you're able to narrowly define what going means so that you can build a report that addresses that particular hypothesis or question. So I love it because it focuses things and gets everybody on the same page of what are we actually trying to accomplish with this report. Now, you managed and oversaw Marketo Measure at Daily Pay for, I think you said about 1.5 years. Is that right? So you start with your implementation, you purpose build everything as part of the implementation. You come out of the implementation with absolutely perfect data because it's all purpose built for Measure. And, you didn't have old, dirty data that we were bringing in. It's all brand new, pristine data. And over the course of the next 1.5 years, you never had to maintain anything. Everything just worked perfectly, right? That's how it goes, right?
Yeah, no, perfect. Yeah, everything was super smooth from there.
Right. So what were some of the like challenges that you ran into, 6 months down the road, a year down the road that you had to overcome to make sure that Marketo Measure was still working for the organization and that you still had that pristine data?
Yeah, absolutely. So like you said, so first 3 months, we're really just collecting data, right? We're like, all right, let's give it a minute to just see how everything shakes out. And then once we really started looking at the data, we were able to start poking holes in it, right? So like 6 months in, we're like, maybe actually we do need a channel for our partners because we have a bunch of referral leads coming in and it just doesn't make sense to have those coming in with no touch points because we know there was some sort of touch point. So we had some conversations about that and, how do referrals, like, how should they fit into our attribution model? Should we exclude them? Should we exclude them? Like things like that. And also like other general maintenance. So we had to like add in a channel for our chat bot. And we talked about if we should even have that channel or not have that channel. And I think one of the more interesting things that we had to like adjust or kind of like Visible helped us see was actually that our UTM structure maybe needed to be refreshed again. Like we were seeing all the campaign names coming in and we were like, actually this is helpful, but we're still missing some key data points that would even help us slice this data more. So maybe we need to go back to the drawing board on that and like have a little bit more of a refresh.
So it didn't just work. You had to actually work at it. This is for the people listening, this is like in the trenches stuff here. This is talking about the work that you have to put into your attribution system to make sure that it stays aligned to the way that the business is going to market. So you had to re-engineer some processes. You had to re-engineer some strategies. You had to re-engineer some data. So how did you navigate asking or working with other teams who had, like, for example, implemented a partner referral strategy where you're like, hey, we might need to rework some of this to make it work really well with Visible to make sure that we can track it. So how did you navigate having to, redo some processes like that after you'd already, implemented months ago?
Yeah, totally. So we had a lot of philosophical discussions, I would say, where it was sort of like, okay, we have this tool, we have all this data being collected, and now we need to figure out how our company wants to look at attribution, because Visible as a tool is going to collect this data and create its own, it has its out-of-box models. But do we agree with those models? Do we not agree with those models? So from the start, like level up was really just first like education on Visible and attribution as a whole, because it is just still like a bit more of an abstract concept, especially with like sales or like channel partners, where it's like, they're not in the trenches or in the weeds, or, people aren't coming to them asking them about MQLs and event budgets. So a lot of education around like why we need attribution and why it's important for us as a team, and how like their opinion really matters if like, should these touch points be included or should they be excluded? And like just trying to get like overall like alignment. And that takes a lot of time. So there's a lot of patience and a lot of, like I said, sort of just like philosophical discussions on like how should we set up our attribution model so that it makes sense for the business in the long term. And we don't have to do that overnight. Like we want it to be a long-term thing, so it doesn't have to happen right this second.
So a lot of patience, a lot of persistence. Yeah, it certainly takes that for sure. Now, you obviously, as you're trying to get these things implemented, you're not getting it done in 1 or 2 sessions. So like, how did you communicate with folks to keep everybody on the same page and making sure that everybody understands what we're doing and why we're doing it, and surfacing some of these reports? Were you like using email updates? Or were you using meetings, like decks, project management systems? Like what were you using to help communicate in all of this new stuff that you've got going on?
Yeah, so I certainly had a couple of decks that I circulated and kept on hand. And we do weekly, Visible or attribution meetings that we'd send out updates for. But I will say, unfortunately, email is just tricky. Some people don't read their emails. So there is something to be said about just getting everyone in a room and having a regular meeting and a regular discussion on like what we're seeing and kind of like if everyone agrees or doesn't agree with it. I think it's really important to have like the internal champions for attribution and the attribution model to really like be able to speak to it in those meetings. And so if other people join, outsiders join from sales or from this, they join those meetings, they like know that someone is like hyper focused on it. And I think that makes everyone feel a little bit more comfortable with the like abstract topic of attribution.
Who are some of the like key stakeholders, like titles and roles that you had in those meetings?
Yeah, so we had like our director of demand generation, we'd have our CMO, we'd have a couple people from data analytics, head of sales ops and enablement, and then our director of systems, so our Salesforce team as well, and then occasionally, some people from our channel or partner teams.
Okay, so a lot of different stakeholders and a lot of different roles. Yeah, that's a lot of coordination. Now, you also told us that you had kind of a recurring reporting cadence that you had built with your CMO that allowed you to kind of report and surface kind of the insights that you were garnering from Marketo Measure Visible. Tell us a little bit about that like reporting cadence that you developed with your CMO.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was really a fascinating meeting that happened every single week, where we would review our Salesforce dashboards that were coming in, that we had a couple different ones from Visible. We also had a Tableau dashboard that the data team helped build, which was really our like business source of truth. So, if we look at the Salesforce Visible dashboard, it was like slightly more in the weeds. And then we had the Tableau dashboard that was like very high level, would get reported like all the way back up the ladder. And those meetings were always really interesting because sometimes they would start with something small with like, let's see how this, can you tell me how this event did? And they would oftentimes end with us discovering way bigger issues that we might have in the system or in our existing processes that we really like needed help for. And that was awesome that our CMO at the time was so involved because, as you're well aware, marketing ops really needs that champion to get marketing ops at the table and make sure that those process things do get done. And so because he was involved in like seeing these things on a weekly basis, he had a really great understanding and like saw like how important it was that we fix some of these fundamental process issues to make sure that our data was reliable in the long term.
So when you started building that cadence, obviously what you ended up with a year and a half down the road is not what you started with. There was a journey that you had to go through to get the right stuff into that reporting cadence. How long did it take you to kind of find your stride, to go through the iteration process and finally get to a place where, everybody was on the same page, everybody had the right expectations, and it kind of just became a well-oiled machine? Like, how long was that maturity process to go from we're starting this reporting cadence now, it's super raw, to now it's like a well-oiled machine?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say even on my way out, it was still becoming better each time. But we worked at it pretty hard for about a year. And in parallel, we were doing other projects, right? So like trying to do like a Salesforce refresh project or changing our lead lifecycle stages and things like that are going to impact all of this attribution data. So a lot of these conversations kind of like bled into that reporting cadence. But yeah, there was a lot of growth over time. It was great to have the data team on there as well to be able to kind of like help us with some of the trickier data points. So things like in the beginning, right, I just had this dashboard that was like, here's our MQLs, here's our sources, super, super simple, super small. And then towards the end, or about a year in, those conversations started evolving to like, well, do we really need to start looking at like marketing qualified accounts? Or do we need to really start looking at like how many MQLs we're getting at these accounts and start weighing our attribution heavier on that front? It was also an interesting shift just to be a part of that with leadership, to like see that whole shift that's happening in marketing right now, which is like a little bit more account focused versus individual MQLs. And then it's like, well, we just got this attribution tool. So now what do we do with that? So those are really great conversations to have.
So what you're saying is that cadence was basically always, to some level, a moving target, and that anybody that's looking to create something like that with their own CMO, you shouldn't expect to nail it on your first or second try. It's going to take you some time to get to a place where it turns into kind of a well-oiled machine. Now, it sounds like you worked for a CMO that was very data-driven. And what would you tell another marketing ops person, someone in your role that doesn't have a data-driven CMO? How would you help them kind of educate their CMO on the value of data?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say be patient and persistent, and have your decks at the ready. It really is helpful when someone asks, like, do you have documentation on this and why it should matter? And you're like, yes, I do. Here's my 10-page quick deck that I could walk you through. Here's the data that exists. Here's what it means. Here's what it doesn't mean. And here's like where we want to go. So I think just being prepared for those conversations is just something good to have in your back pocket.
Yeah. Again, persistence and patience. Absolutely. Key things to keep in mind for operations professionals. So let's talk a little bit about kind of you now. So, the job market is better now than it was in 2023, but you were actually able to switch positions in 2023, which is, it was very difficult to do so. So what were some of the skills that you acquired at Daily Pay that really you think helped you find your current gig and where you are now?
Totally. Yeah. And so I think because I was so in the trenches, if you will, at Daily Pay, it really helped me like build up this like long list of experiences that I now have. So, whether it's moving from HubSpot to Marketo, or setting up a Marketo instance, or setting up a Marketo Measure instance, and like setting up all this like foundational work, really, I feel like just gave me like all the tools that I needed to then, want to go somewhere else and like take everything that I've learned and apply it elsewhere. Like kind of started, and I'm really lucky and feel really grateful that I did. I started like where I got to build my own Marketo and like build everything that the way that I wanted it to be. But now the challenge is sort of like, okay, now what happens when you go to a company and they have an established marketing operations team, and you're going to inherit an instance? Like, then what do you do? How do you like want to change it from there? Or like, how do you make it better? How do you make it more scalable and things like that? So that's kind of how I approached it and how I'm doing it now.
Do you think that some of the attribution specific skills that you got with Daily Pay and using Marketo Measure were key skills that you have that helped you get your current role?
I certainly like to think so. I think that, in my head, marketing operations is always like twofold, is what I tell all my friends. At least I'm like, there's like half is like the execution side and like processes. And then the other half is data and like trying to help teams show like the impact that their campaigns are having, or that, all of this is having on the entire marketing engine. So I was exposed very much so to both ends of it, which I definitely think helped me land my new role.
Do your friends actually understand what you do at all?
No way.
Yeah, I can't explain. I don't know. I cannot explain marketing ops to people. I'm always just like, it's the techie, nerdy data side of marketing. That's all I can say.
Yeah, I've tried. I'm going to keep trying, but who knows?
It's tough. So in your new role at Braze, which is a fantastic company, by the way, what are some of the things that you're looking forward to learning at Braze?
Yeah, so super excited to have joined the team. We've got a great international team of MoPros, so a lot that I can learn from the other team members. But I'm excited to be working for an international company and just really like learning how to take marketing operations like to the next level. So what happens when we have different regions, and like how do we do attribution globally? Like, what does that look like? What does attribution look like when we don't have visible and super clean visible data? So those are the things that I'm really excited about, and I feel just excited to dig into at Braze.
Do you think that attribution is possible right now where you're at without having visible in place? Like, what are some of the things that you're seeing related to trying to do attribution without something like visible in place?
Yeah, so I will say I've just started to scratch the surface, of course. But I think it's going to be an interesting journey because without the system, like I said, with visible, it was sort of nice because we had this clean system, and then we just had to worry about the philosophical, educational discussions. And now I think it'll kind of be both. Like, we have to figure out the system side of it, to figure out questions, attribution models, building from scratch, which will be interesting.
Okay. Yeah. It's going It's going to be tough trying to do without a system like Visible in place for sure. So, you've worked in attribution pretty successfully at Daily Pay. You've got, you're starting to scratch the surface at your current role. Do you think that attribution do you find value in attribution? Do you think that it does help organizations understand which investments are working and which are not? And do you think that it's a pipe dream, or do you think that it's actually something that you can achieve and make good, solid decisions from?
I absolutely think it's something that you can achieve and make good, solid decisions from. I think that attribution will always have to exist in some form as long as marketing teams have budgets that they need to, get and look at and understand. Like I said earlier, it's really important to have that like internal champion of attribution. So I think when I think about like the future, I think it's going to be really important to have almost like a attribution SME or like focused person like on marketing ops teams that is maybe like half a data person, half on the marketing ops team or something like that, that can really speak to why attribution is important and how it's working. Like, again, like I think the educational aspect is so important when you're trying to explain to other members of the marketing team what attribution means and why they should see value in it.
So what you're saying is every single marketing operations team on the planet needs a Bailey Bowes.
Essentially.
Perfect. I agree personally. Absolutely. Everybody, I think that a marketing ops team that doesn't have somebody that has kind of general oversight over data quality and analytics, I think you're going to miss a lot if you don't have somebody who's accountable for that. I'm thinking now in like a racy chart, but like somebody has to be accountable for that in the organization. So I think having somebody like yourself as part of the marketing ops team, I think every marketing ops team needs it personally.
Absolutely.
All right. So we're going to move away from marketing attribution and all the techie nerdy talk. We always like to ask a non-attribution question at the end of these interviews to, just let people get to know you. So personally, I'm a huge music fan. I'm always listening to music. I always love hearing what others are listening to. So what music are you listening to right now? Artists, bands, genres? What do you got?
Yeah, today I'm listening to Maggie Rogers. Her new album, Don't Forget Me, just came out today. So I've been streaming that on repeat.
All right, Maggie Rogers. I don't know Maggie Rogers. I'm going to have to go give it a listen.
Look it up. And I guess an extra freebie would also be, of course, Beyonce's Cowboy Carter. Also phenomenal album.
There you go. Yep. Perfect. Awesome. All right. So before I let you go, I want to do kind of a quick little recap of some of the like key learnings and takeaways that I think I've learned from you today. One of them was earlier on when you were talking about, when you're starved for data and then suddenly you have like a mountain of data available to you, it's really easy to get sucked into that data and just want to dive right in. So instead of just like diving headfirst in, it's a really good idea to start like looking at hypotheses and testing hypotheses to help focus what part of the mountain of data are we going to focus on? Because that mountain can be really intimidating, and it's also really easy to look at the wrong parts of the mountain. So that hypothesis testing is super important. The other one that was a key takeaway, I think, is that when you're talking about attribution and you onboard with a system, you have to also start having conversations about like adding channels as touch points, like partner referrals. Like, how do we track that with our attribution platform? Or what you talked about with onboarding your chatbot, how do we track our chatbot or SDR activities? And you constantly have to have conversations about adjusting processes to make sure that process or that particular channel or tactic is trackable by your attribution system. You can't just leave it alone and assume that it's going to track a whole new channel that you just onboarded. Another one was related to kind of like the conversation about your cadence with your CMO, that like everything is a work in progress and that we need to continue to iterate on things and continue to just make gradual improvements, stay curious, And then, set the expectation that it's going to be a process of continued learning. Like, we're not going to get answers to every question tomorrow, but over time, we will get answers to those questions. Sometimes it takes time, and we just got to have a little patience to get there. Another one that you mentioned is the future of attribution is in having champions in the organization and education throughout the organization. If you don't have a champion in the organization, attribution is not going to go far. It really isn't. It just won't. And then lastly is in relation to like your particular career and experience, learning new tools and solving organization-wide problems is a great way to grow and secure your career. Like, you are now in a place where like every marketing ops team needs a Bailey Bowes. Whether they know it or not, they do. And that's because you've approached your career with curiosity and openness to learn new tools and then take those tools to solve big business problems.
Absolutely. Yeah. Beautifully put with a big, I'm flattered at the end. So it's great.
Well, Bailey, I want to thank you for taking the time to talk to me today. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your thoughts on attribution and how you've kind of built some of your experience and career around that. So thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. It was great getting to know you a little bit better.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
On our next episode, we'll be talking with Chris Walker. You've seen him on LinkedIn. You know he's an attribution critic, and yet he's now a member of Attribution Nation. I've been looking forward to this one for a very, very long time, like since I came up with the idea for the podcast. So we'll be ending this season with Chris Walker. Hope you'll join us.